We are particularly honored to be joined this evening by Father Mark Bosco, Vice President of Mission and Ministry, who will introduce our speaker and participate in the program as we continue. Please join me in welcoming Father Mark.
Thank you, Dean Hamasi, and welcome everyone to tonight's evening. I have the great honor to introduce our author, George Saunders. I first came under the spell of Mr. Saunders' writing while reading his short story collection, 10th of December, which immediately sent me to another one of his collections, Paul Elie. His short stories and his journalistic essays reflect on the lost and the disenfranchised, especially those who thought they were part of the found and now find themselves part of the lost. In this way, his themes, if not his style, remind me of Flannery O'Connor. I think you knew that was coming. For both of them are satirists of the self-deluded, living in a nation self-deluded, and yet always preparing the reader for a shocking or revelatory tenderness, which is at the heart of human life. Born in Texas but raised on the south side of Chicago, Saunders started his adult journey with a degree in geophysics from the Colorado School of Mines. After a short stint as a geophysicist, he discovered writing. He says in his bio, quote, "I've always been interested in reading ever since a nun I was secretly in love with turned me on to Jimmy Tremaine in 3rd grade. But I never met a writer, and so it took me a while to realize that a person could actually write for a living." I think we should all thank Sister for turning the switch on for his love of writing and reading. Indeed, raised Catholic in Chicago, but now a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, I would argue that his spiritual vision informs his fiction. He is a graduate of the MFA program at Syracuse University, where he was mentored by Tobias Wolff, among others, another great story writer and a sort of spiritual godfather to an array of other writers. I myself knew Toby from my days at Stanford and know of his care for writers. Since 1996, Saunders has taught in the Syracuse program, where he now continues that tradition, teaching and mentoring other writers. Saunders' work has appeared in The New Yorker, GQ, Harper's Magazine, and numerous anthologies. In 2006, he received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, and in 2013, was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time. Already a nationally recognized short story writer, memoirist, and journalist, Mr. Saunders published his first novel at the age of 58. The novel, Lincoln and the Bardo, from which we will hear the author read from momentarily, won the Man Booker Prize in 2017 and became a bestseller. It is a pleasure to read and a pleasure to listen to. I think it's the first time I ever read a book and then immediately went out and bought the audio because everyone talked about how wonderful it was, a new sense of humor, things that I might have missed, and really quite fantastic. As the title of our evening with the author suggests, the intersectionality between Catholicism, Buddhism, and writing, I am struck by the way that Lincoln in the Bardo seems to fuse together two different frames of reference, Catholic and Buddhist, especially for dealing what I would call perhaps salvation anxiety. One senses two great spiritual works of art underneath the novel, the Purgatorio of Dante's Divine Comedy and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The salvation anxiety at the center of the novel is the death of Abraham Lincoln's beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, and the Oak Hill Cemetery, just down the road from us here at Georgetown. It becomes a liminal space, that cemetery, the site, perhaps, where this anxiety is performed and ultimately resolved. Stylistically, Saunders tickles our postmodern funny bone by opening with alternating chapters of pure fiction with a sort of pastiche of historical accounts about Lincoln's history. Yet the strange stylistic form becomes narratively a sort of Bardo, an intermediate state between life and death, fact and fiction. But what is most affecting for me, at least, is how Mr. Saunders writes about suffering. filled with a pathos born from Christian and Buddhist roots, the spiritual experience of sorrow is in many ways at the heart of the novel. I end my introduction with words from the novel that expresses this so beautifully. I hope this is not what you were going to read.
Hear it twice.
His mind was freshly inclined toward sorrow, toward the fact that the world was full of sorrow, that everyone labored under some burden of sorrow, that all were suffering. That whatever way one took in this world, one must try to remember that all were suffering, none content, all wronged, neglected, overlooked, misunderstood. And therefore one must do what one could to lighten the load of those with whom one came into contact. That his current state of sorrow was not uniquely his, nor at all, but rather its like had been felt, would be felt, by scores of others in all times, in every time, and must not be prolonged or exaggerated, because in this state he could be of no help to anyone, and given that his position in the world situated him to be either of great help or great heart, it would not do to stay low if he could help it. Understanding and feeling sympathy for others, of accompanying others in sorrow, both on this side of life and in the next, that seems to be the singular achievement of the book for me. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce George Saunders to share with us a reading, and then to invite him to sit with our Berkley Center Senior Fellow, Paul Elie, for a conversation about religion and the writing life. Mr. Saunders.
After that, you just want to kind of call it quits. Yes? What he said is absolutely correct. Have a good night. So I thought I would talk just a little bit about the Buddhist Catholic writing intersection, which I've never really talked formally about, but I've been thinking about it the last couple of weeks. And so I was raised on the south side of Chicago, as you can hear, in the 60s, which was a very Catholic-rich time. You could feel sort of Dorothy Day on the horizon. The Mass was still in Latin. And according to my mom, who I have no reason to distrust, I could say the whole Mass in Latin as a 4-year-old, and you know. So for me, the looking back, I think the Catholic Mass was kind of the first work of art that I'd ever blundered into in this way. First of all, I can remember sitting there, just a little kid. Everyone was dressed up. We would always pick up an older lady from next door and very ritually drive her in the car to St. Clair de Montefalco. You sit there and I could feel, again in retrospect, I could feel Europe in the room, old cathedral, and then you got that sense that there was an enactment of a belief system that was 3 or 4 dimensional that many generations of people had contributed to. So many small touches in each Mass, and even as a kid I was sensitive to that. I used to go home and make this kind of embarrassing story to tell in public, but I would take a little table and make altars at night. And my mom very sweetly would indulge me by buying different linens so I could get the colors right and so on. But I think I felt very strongly then something bigger than myself, something bigger than my family, and I was participating in it. I also noticed, then I went on, we moved to a south suburb, and we went into a Catholic school, grade school. I read the epistle, which was a big honor, and this feeling here is what I remember. I have a microphone and you're seated, ha ha ha, you know. But also the very real sense of reading beautiful language, and the idea that the way you read it affected the way it was received, and you could feel the energy in the room when you'd gotten it right. You felt that you'd gone, out of your little measly 8-year-old body, and all of those people had risen out of their bodies, and you'd met above the room somewhere in a kind of a sanctified space. And finally, for me, the biggest thing was this. You'd go into the Mass in a certain frame of mind, yourself, and then you'd sit there. And even though, if you were me, you were often thinking about the White Sox, or thinking about the girl you really liked in the third row, slowly, as they say in Buddhism, the pebble would sink down through the turgid water into deeper and deeper and more quiet depths. And by the end of the Mass, I was a different kid, doing all the things we know, resolving to be better, being super thoughtful on the way out, opening the door even if someone wasn't there, just because I was feeling so Christ-like. But it was very powerful, and it was a very just sincere, beautiful thing in my life. It all culminated in one evening that I don't often talk about because I don't like to squander it, but here's what happened. This was in the period where suddenly you could discharge your Sunday responsibility by going to Saturday night Mass. This was a new thing. For one of the first times I got to walk down there by myself. That was exciting. I walked to church, of my own volition. And I sat there, and as I sat there, I was going into this quiet state of mind. And I think I had a profound moment of lineage recognition, the idea that Peter and Paul, they were real. Jesus was a real person. Why not? Why couldn't I join that lineage? It was a kind of an ecstatic feeling, a sense of destiny. And my idea of Jesus at the time was, again, retrospectively, Jesus as a novelist, which meant this. When Jesus saw the woman at the well, or when Jesus saw anybody, Jesus had a capacity to not judge, to see purely, and to love completely. And it struck me as a kid what an incredibly powerful state that would be. If you could enact that state, and it happened to me a little bit that Friday night, if you could enact that state, you would never have to be afraid. You would never be in doubt of what to do because your energy would always be going outward in a sense of concern and of complete acceptance. So I was sitting in church and I was having this really lovely but real experience. And of course, because I'm also, in addition to being a Catholic by religion, I was a neurotic. I started thinking, uh-oh, this is going to slip away. I don't want to ever leave this seat because as soon as I leave the seat, I'm going to lose it. And my mom and dad had a standing date with our friends, the Pluchars, to play cards and do some drinking and listen to Charlie Pride and kind of old country music. And we were going there, and I knew if I went there, I was going to lose this thing. And I did. Went to the house, and minute by minute, I'm like, I'm losing it. And I'd go, because I'd sneak off and try to recapture the feeling, and I couldn't. But my sense now is that spirituality is really, it consists of simply this, having one moment like that in your life, and never doubting the reality of that moment, and then attempting in some way to make space in your actual life for that to reoccur. Even if it doesn't reoccur, to continue to convince yourself that such a thing is real and possible. That was what I really took from Catholicism. I also at one point walked in on a priest and a nun French kissing. So that, 1970, the very tall nun, very short priest. And yet I have children. But one other thing I wanted to mention, Stations of the Cross for us were a really big deal. And the way we would do it at St. Damien in Oak Forest was there were a series of images around the church, depictions of the stations. And then we would come in and usually the priest would read descriptions of each one. And we were encouraged by one nun, and I don't know if this is a general practice, but we were encouraged that as these were being recited to intensely visualize the scene in our mind. And she said, see if you can be the different characters. So you had to be a Roman guard. You had to be Pontius Pilate. You had to be the mother of Jesus. That, I think, was early novelizing, basically. And again, this process did not leave you unmoved. It was an incredibly ambiguous feeling to be the Roman guard that pierced Jesus' side, to be Jesus, to be his mother watching this, and to try to hold those realities simultaneously in your mind, which of course is impossible. But what a feeling of, I guess, suspended judgment, which quickly transforms into a kind of love. They're almost the same thing, I think. So this is the, so I went to college, and like a lot of kids of that era, I just drifted away. No particular reason. It wasn't the kissing nun and priest that I totally understood and didn't mind. But I drifted away. And honestly, I didn't really regain a spiritual life as such until we had our kids. And Paula, my wife, was also, she was more of a fundamentalist background. But we both, in that moment of going, we love these kids so much, and we feel so under-equipped to take care of them, we turned back to the church. First the Lutheran church, then the Episcopal church. And in that process, Paula was interested in meditation. And in the particular world we were in, we couldn't get much instruction. There were a lot of like cassettes with weird sounds and no real instruction. And in that time, she went to a teaching by a Tibetan Nyingma Buddhist teacher. And she came back just like, wow, I don't know what that was, but I'm going to find out. So she started meditating, and I was kind of just skeptically on the outside. And if you're married, you may know that you have a certain number of fights that you have all the time. A couple nods, okay. But I noticed this. We approach fight 12B concerning the toilet seat, and I would just in my whole body be ready to enact the fight, and suddenly she wasn't doing it. She wasn't going for it. She had changed in her personhood. Actually, somehow it was just. And I said, I got to get some of that. So I started meditating, and what I noticed was simply this, and it was such a small thing, but at that point, with the kids young, it was important. There was suddenly about a 0.4 second space between the thought appearing and my decision to enact it or not. So, instead of saying to your kid, hey, pick that up, the thought would appear in your head, and you'd say, you don't want to be that guy, and you would just shut up. That's goodness, So we started on this path of Tibetan Nyingma Buddhism, about which I won't say much because I'm not that good of a practitioner, and it's such a deep practice that I don't want to sully it. But let me segue a little bit into the writing and how it maybe relates to everything else. Okay, I had a working class background, so I didn't really understand art, and I assumed it was kind of this thing that I couldn't quite do. Good writing was just beyond my grasp. And so in that state, I was very conceptual about it. I thought what you did is you took the story apart, Hemingway, who I loved, analyze it, and just do that. So the idea was that the writer was someone who was supposed to know the effect he wanted to get, and then get it. And you, the audience, were supposed to sit there while I pull up my manure truck full of my concepts, and all I knew about traveling in Asia is, blah, just dump it on you. I wrote in that mode for quite a long time, and it ended up in a novel, and I can tell you how good the novel was just by giving you the title, La Boda de Eduardo. It was my story about a Mexican wedding I attended, and I I worked on it for about 2 years, and our kids were little, and we had a lot writing on. And I actually told Paula when I started, I said, you are sitting on a gold mine. So I went on for 2 years. I was working full time. I'd come home at night, have a pot of coffee, and if I was feeling particularly ambitious, a little bottle of Boone's Farm. Not a little bottle, but the whole bottle of Boone's Farm. And then I would write until I fell asleep at the desk, and then I'd trudge into the bedroom, go to sleep, get up the next morning. Did this for about, I think, 2 years. At the end, I had a 700-page manuscript, and I said to Paula, as writers do, I've got something you might want to take a look at. I'm not sure it's good, but have a look. Take your time, no rush. So then I burst outside the door. And I looked in, and honestly, it's a joke now, but it wasn't at the time. She's on about page 5, and she's doing this. But the minute I saw that, I knew everything that was wrong with the book in the way that you do. I'd known it all along, but I just couldn't admit it. So I went into work the next day completely empty of any ambition, which is a nice state to be in if you're a writer, actually. I suck, and I'm 32, So then, and I was a transcriptionist for a conference call. That's what I was doing. And just so you can complete the picture, I had a ponytail and about the same hairline as I do now. So it was a good look for a transcriber of a conference call. So I'm so bored, and there's nothing to do. So I'm writing these little Seussian kind of scatological poems, just nasty little, and as I finished one, I'd flip it over and draw a cartoon. And I did that for about 10 poems worth. And I was about to throw it away, and something held me back. And I brought it home, threw it on the table, went off to play with the kids. And I heard from the next room this incredibly blessed sound I hadn't heard in years of Paula laughing sincerely with my work, not at it. And it was after a long period where, if you're a writer, you know this feeling. You give somebody your story, and they say, I read your story. I did. Or worse yet, they say, well, it was interesting. Oh, the worst. So, but she was laughing from the gut. She was really enjoying it. So something clicked in me. And to sort of summarize it, what I thought was, all this time I've been writing from a position of total control, anticipating the effects I would get, and I was also keeping out a lot of things that were genuinely me that I was a little ashamed of. So I talk kind of fast, you might notice. I always resort to humor in any kind of situation. My first girlfriend said, "I'm going to break up with you because you're always joking." I said, "Yeah," and then I just made a joke. Right in the butt. So it's a defense mechanism. I also love pop culture. I was raised on it. I love it. So all that stuff, I've been keeping it out. And when Paula laughed at that story, suddenly it was like a scream came down, and your actual approach is standing back there. So I instantly knew what to do, which is, in short, was to be entertaining. Allow yourself to be entertaining. The second thing, which is a little more subtle, thereafter, whenever I was writing, I was always aware, let's say, that there was a meter in my head. And this side was marked P for positive, this was N for negative. And as you're reading, you're actually doing sort of a meditative thing, which is you're reading, but you're pretending like you're somebody else who hasn't read it. And you're watching that meter to see how it's doing. So the entire craft of writing, in my view, is honestly look at the meter, don't dress it up. Don't say, "Oh, it was good yesterday," but watch that meter. If it starts to flag, don't panic. What most of us do is say, "Oh no, I stink. I have to go to law school after all." You know. But if you can maintain your sort of simple mind and say, "All right, little story, what's going on?" And the story will always say something to you quietly. First, it'll say, "Nothing's wrong. I'm about patriarchy. Just move along, move along." But then if you're gentle with it and with yourself and you say, "No, really, it's okay. What's wrong with you? My needle definitely dropped." It'll say, "Well, I'm boring." It's like, "Oh, you are boring. That's all right. It's okay. We're all friends here. Where are you boring?" "You know where? Page 6. So basically, the idea is you can read your own work somewhat. You can simulate a first-time reader, and then you can make adjustments, small adjustments, a phrase, a comma. This, in turn, it does a very important thing. It puts you into an intimate, authentic relation with your reader. In other words, instead of her being down there and you lecturing down her, she's on your level. And actually, if you're doing this method right, she's a little above you. She's smarter, she's kinder, she's been around the world more, she's read a lot more than you have. So you're desperately trying to keep her attention by means of the great attention keeper, respect. Now, that's a nice general idea. How does it manifest particularly? Line by line. So, here's an example for you, kind of a stupid example. But let's say you started with the story, with a sentence. Frank walked into the room and sat down on the brown couch. It's a sentence. I don't really want it in my book, but it's a sentence. Then we start applying a friend from my Catholic years, the inner nun. And we let the inner nun look at that sentence. And she says, "Mr. Saunders, if Frank is going to sit down on the brown couch, does he need to come into the room, or is that implied?" Good point, sister. We cut it out. Frank sat down on the brown couch. "Mr. Saunders, is it redundant to say sat down on?" Good point. Frank sat on the brown couch. What's with the brown? Good point. Frank sat on the couch. And suddenly we're in Hemingway territory now. We're really, Then, if she's a good inner nun, she says, "What's the relevance of sitting on a couch?" And you say, "Good point." And you cut that too. And then you're down to Frank. So one thing is you don't stink yet. You're just Frank. But in a more serious way, that is what originality actually consists of, is cutting out the habituated, cutting out the autopilot, and insisting that you be in intimate relationship with your reader, even if it means stripping everything away but Frank. The second way that this method can work is that, as you're doing this line-by-line attempt to respect your reader, mysteriously, and I've never understood this, your stories get deeper, they get more compassionate, they get more ambiguous. So let me do another stupid example. Frank was a jerk. That's my first sentence of my novel, called Frank. Frank was okay. Again, that sentence, if I read that, my meter would go down a bit because I don't like the feeling of judgment that's in it, right? So the gods of fiction always know what to ask, and what they say is, you say Frank was a jerk, that's how they talk. How so? And so you say, oh, how so? Frank was a jerk because he snapped at the young barista who was coming out of the back room with tears on her cheeks. Oh, Frank, you were a jerk. Then the gods of fiction say, why do you think he did that? Okay. Frank snapped at the young barista who was coming out of the back room with tear-stained cheeks because she reminded him of Marie. Who's Marie? His what? His dead wife. Now suddenly, just with the intention of making a less facile sentence, of being in more communication with your reader, Frank has gone from a jerk to a man so capable of love that when he lost that love, he couldn't even behave like a decent human being. It results in a better sentence, a more complex sentence, and you could certainly fix that sentence out. Most importantly, it creates a sense of curiosity in the reader. I've been telling this story for months. I don't know what happened, but I kind of want to know what Frank does about this. And it makes plot, because even if Frank just goes out and sits in his car, we've made the weight of this moment when he's not behaved well, and we can feel it. That's plot. So the point of all this is that for me, the big leap forward I made in writing was when I did a number of things. I gave up controlling the material. I became aware of this meter. And really what happened was I started writing by intuition. In other words, when I'm editing, I'm just literally making snap decisions on something even less than a feeling. It's just a micro impulse. And the value of iteration. I do this over and over and over again, and slowly the story starts to take shape and become, and here's the last thing, a better person than I am. It's funnier, it's wittier, it thinks more of my fellow man than I do actually in real life. It opens questions instead of closing them down. It's very comfortable with ambiguity. In fact, that ship steers itself towards the highest kinds of ambiguity. So to make the connection, here's what I think happens. I'm 60 years old. I'm kind of sick of this guy. I know all of his stuff. I know his mental loops very well. You know, nostalgia loop 8B involves Devil's Lake, Wisconsin, blah, blah, blah. That guy I'm not so interested in. But when I'm in this mode of writing, and I think it's neurological, something happens. The rumination stops. The confidence stops. The desire to control narrative stops. And something else arises. I think it's a kind of wisdom that comes up. It's definitely a brain state because it's reproducible. But it feels to me very much like what happens when one meditates. And it feels very much like what happened to me back in the day in that church. So, to me now at this point, writing has become more than a career. It has become a bit of an adjunct of a spiritual life in this sense. Buddhism tells us, if I understand it correctly, that we basically make the world with mind. You wake up in a bad mood, the world sucks. What a stupid bedspread. What a dumb sunrise. Ugh. The next day you wake up and suddenly, oh, what a tasteful bedspread on a beautiful morning. You know, the bedspread and the morning haven't really changed, but your perceiving apparatus has. If that's true, which I believe it is, and if we have a method by which we can enact different mind states, better mind states, that's an infinitely hopeful thing. And if that's not spirituality, I don't know what is. So at this point in my life, I'm kind of dimly aware of this idea that wisdom can be induced by practice. I'm also very aware that death is coming and that ego is so intractable that one life is not going to be enough for me to overturn it at all. But the fact that it's possible is something very, very cheering to me. So with this in mind, with your permission, I'll read something not from Lincoln and maybe we can talk about it. The other thing that unites Buddhism and Catholicism in writing is death. I'm really into death. Mainly because I think if we could really recognize that death is real and coming for all of us, it would change every instant of our lives. So let me read you just a little comic reflection on death. And this is in the form of diary entries from a middle-aged guy. He's kind of in a hurry. His kids are little and he's sort of frazzled. So he often leaves off articles of speech. If he wants to say plus or minus or equals, he gives the mathematical symbol to save himself some time. And feel free to laugh, by the way, this is it's totally all right. You know? Or if you don't want to, I have another thing I can read, which is a 700-page... It's about penance, 700-page penance. All right, September 13th. Sorry for silence. Crazy thing happened this week. Monday, Todd Grassberger died. Future readers know Todd. Have I mentioned? Probably have not mentioned. Todd, not close friend, just work colleague. Todd and I had a running joke where I had never returned Firewire I had borrowed. In fact, his company Firewire, not his. He knew, I knew he knew. It was just our joke. At 2, word rippled through office. Todd, dead. Had heart attack at dry cleaner just now during lunch. All afternoon, no one working. Everyone stunned, milling around, trying to process fact that Todd equal dead. Under Todd's desk, a pair of hiking boots. Against one wall, walking stick Todd used to take on lunchtime walks in woods. Weird sun shower around 3. Linda Hurtney, it's like a final goodbye from Todd. Linda equal nut. Once claimed Crow on Ledge was reincarnation of her dead husband. Said she could tell by the way Crow's head was cocked disapprovingly at large lunch she was eating. Then storm over, parking lot glistening. All evening, found myself looking afresh at Pam, kids. Everything suddenly precious. Said prayer before dinner. Do not usually pray before dinner, but tonight, held hands, prayed. Prayed we would be grateful for our good fortune, grateful for each other. Prayed we'd remember that various ups, downs we may experience as family equal small bumps in road compared with this. Prayed for Todd, prayed for Todd's family. Just nights ago, Todd was in own house, doing whatever Todd did at night, taking change out of pockets, having laugh with kids, petting dog, thinking of future, tossing dirty clothes in hamper. Where is Todd tonight? September 14th. Todd Grassberger funeral today at Ukrainian church downtown. Todd apparently from humble roots. Priest equal long-haired guy in cassock. Sings, chants, whole service in Ukrainian from memory. As he chants paces, cassock rope swings. Scary guy. Very intense. Sermon. Why this surprising? Did you think you were going to live forever? Only difference between you sitting there anticipating the rest of your day and Todd in coffin, bound for eternal home in cold earth, is heartbeat. Feel that, people? In your chest? That is thin line between you and grave. So why do you live like you're eternal? That foolish. You are fools. This scary? This not scary. This truth. This reality. Shouts. Shall we wake up? Shall we? Everyone staring big-eyed at priest. Except usual congregants who seem to have heard all before. Priest goes on. Which of us will die tonight? Do we think he's being facetious? That shows we are dopes. Any one of us could die tonight. Die right now. Suddenly come up short of breath, keel over in pew, be with Todd, in earth, and wink of eye. Suddenly from downstairs kitchen, smell of roast beef. Happy chatter from church ladies down in kitchen. Smell of roast beef plus sound of pots clanking, plates being set out, equal appealing. People shifting in pews due to amazing smell of beef. Todd's 2 brothers come to lectern, make tributes. Older brother, Todd sweet. Todd funny. Todd a powerful force in his life. We'll never forget wonder that was Todd. Younger brother, yes, Todd super strong person. Todd equal bull. Although Todd could be somewhat firm, Todd did younger brother much good in long run by teaching him how to stand up for himself. That's to say, having been pushed around by Todd throughout entire childhood, nothing can now faze younger brother. I.e., no bully in outside world will ever be equal of Todd. But Todd's so great. Todd the best. Todd's so smart, so good looking. No wonder Todd's mom plus dad always treated him, younger brother, like afterthought. But Todd's so caring, so perceptive. Todd understood this, would sometimes console younger brother by saying that he, younger brother, was perfectly fine in own way. Often just before making promise they had made, re Wednesday night being younger brother's night to borrow dad's car. thereby ruining younger brother's chance to see this girl he really liked. Possible love of life. Girl he eventually lost to this dope from Selden. Dope whose own older brother apparently more inclined than Todd to give his younger brother a decent shot at family car. Todd's younger brother, breathless, pauses at lectern, can't seem to stop self, plunges ahead. But Todd great. Todd's so great. Todd will surely be missed. Todd taught everyone in family an important lesson. Although a person might be bellicose, ambitious, slightly blind to needs of others, still, it does not mean person not greatest, most amazing brother ever, who occasionally, as if to spite self, might suddenly, surprising all, do some reasonably thoughtful thing. Younger brother, seemingly perplexed by own tribute, then led away from lectern by scowling older brother, hissing something in undertone. Todd's widow approaches lectern, can't seem to speak. 3 little girls clinging to her skirt. Widow hands microphone to smallest girl. Smallest girl. Bye, Daddy. Lunch, good. Lunch beyond good. Funeral so sad, lunch equal heaven. Eat 3 roast beef sandwiches in row off paper plate. Outside, yellow tree blowing in wind. Single yellow leaf blows in through open basement window. Watch it come down, land near my shoe. Think, life beautiful. So glad I'm not dead. If, when I die, do not want Pam lonely. Want her to remarry, have full life. As long as new husband is nice guy. Gentle guy. Religious guy. Very caring plus good to kids. But kids not fooled. Kids prefer dead dad to religious guy. Pale, boring religious guy with no oomph, who wears weird sweaters and is always a little sad due to cannot get boner, due to physical ailment. Death very much on my mind, future reader. Can it be true that I will die? That Pam, kids will die? Is awful. Why were we put here so inclined to love when end of our story equal death? That harsh, that cruel, do not like. Note to self, try harder in all things to be better person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. I want to invite now Paul Elie to come to the stage. Paul is senior fellow at the Berkley Center. Himself, a writer, has certainly written about the Catholic novelists and the Catholic imagination in the 20th century, and the life you say may be your own. Has done the same thing with the Protestant imagination and the work of Bach and how it's been transformed by musicians through time, and is a regular at the New Yorker, the New York Times, and others. So it's a real great delight to have him start this conversation together.
Thank you, Father Mark, and thank you, George Saunders. I'm not really sure I'm necessary here. I listened to you speak, and I was inspired and emboldened and entertained. I thought, what can I add to this? I thought, well, this guy's having so much fun. I'll get him around to death. But then you just did that.
Oh, I got more.
So why don't we start at a very literal level. I set out from DuPont Circle this morning and walked to Oak Hill Cemetery, where I'd not been before, and found my way down the winding path to the mausoleum, the Carroll Mausoleum. And somebody in this audience will know whether the Carrolls who owned that mausoleum were the Carrolls who were so bound up with the history of this university. We can maybe get to that during the Q&A. I went on the winding path and down the steps and onto the unpaved walking path, past all the other mausoleums and to the Carroll Mausoleum. And your novel had put me in the place of a man, Abraham Lincoln, in the saddest moment of his life, walking on the path on which I was this morning walking. But it had also put me on the path of you, the novelist, and what the incipient novelist at that point. 20 years ago, seeing that mausoleum and being in a place of receptivity to this idea that came to fruition in the novel. So can now you put us there and tell us how that happened?
Sure, and actually it's funny because my wife's cousin Courtney is here, and Courtney was the person who gave me the idea. I had never heard of, I didn't even actually know that Lincoln's son had died. And we were driving past Oak Hill Cemetery back, I think in the Clinton years, and she just said, I just read about this, that Lincoln had, the newspapers at the time said that Lincoln had gone into the crypt so grief-stricken that he held the body. And I just went, wow, you know. And at that time, I had written one book, and, you know, much like that piece, very satirical, some of it quite sci-fi. Yeah, and I just didn't feel, you know, the intersection between what it would take to write that book and my skill set was zero. I just couldn't, I'd think about it and nothing would appear. So periodically I just think, well, that's a great story. I wish I could write it maybe in another life or, you know. And then about, I guess, 2011, Courtney again saved my life because we went to the cemetery and we couldn't find that crypt.
I couldn't find it this morning.
It's really hard, isn't it? It's off in the corner. And
Here's
so,
the map, but it didn't help at all.
right? Yeah, we must have similar map readings. But Courtney went off and found it, and we were just about to leave, and she said, you know, it's kind of far, but I did find it. So I thought, well, yeah, we should take a look. And just as you described, being there and thinking, all right, forget fiction. We know that Lincoln stood on this spot. We know that Lincoln ducked down to get into the chapel. So that got in my head, and I still was a little afraid to write it because you think about a novel about the death of a child. Lincoln, it's got a lot of potential to go off the rails, you know, and I was scared about it. And then in 2012, I had 10th of December came out and was successful beyond my wildest dreams. Maybe not my wildest dreams, but, you know, and I just thought, you know, you're 52. This story has been in your heart for 20 years now. Whenever I would be artistically happy or satisfied, my mind would go to that story. And the answer was always, you're not good enough, which is a depressing answer. And especially if you want to keep having an artistic life, you have to go into that fear, which sounds good theoretically, but when the fear was as palpable and it was related to a very specific thing, which was my shortage of gifts, you know, I didn't really know how to be confident writing a straight scene, a scene with no comedy. I didn't have any confidence about how to do historical writing at all. But I just thought, you know, you're 52. If you say no to this book because you don't think you're a big-hearted enough person or writer, then you have just begun your downward spiral as an artist. You have, because you said, I can only do this thing that I've already done. That's that sentence. On your grave, it will say, failed to do that which he most wanted to try. You know, not. So I just thought, okay, I'm gonna. And I talk to my students a lot about this idea of self-gaming, which is to say, you, the person, and you, the artist, are different. You, the person, have the job of managing that poor little writer and helping him or her to get there and do the work. So what I had to do was say to my artist self, look, this will probably be a big failure. If it is, so what? You had a good book. Give yourself a 6-month contract of silence. You're going to go write this book for 6 months, be as wild as you can be. If it doesn't work at the end of 6 months, you're going to throw it away and not tell anybody. No harm. You've wasted 6 months before in your life on stupider things than this. So I did that, and that was nice because then I could really take the wild swing at it, stumbled on this form, and then at some point I'm like, okay, I really am going to try to finish it.
It reminds me of the book The Gift by Lewis Hyde. Lewis, who was a guest here at Georgetown, writes about the artistic process. For him, art is the gift that is given back. So in a sense, in Lewis's vocabulary, this intuition about Lincoln as a story to be told, Lincoln and Willie Lincoln, was some sort of gift, or in a moment of receptivity, you grasped a story there that, because it refused to go away, there would have been something more than practical in refusing that story after a certain point. And so that, yes, saying your career is in this downward spiral, but also that somehow you'd receive this possibility, and to turn it away is to turn away artistic life itself, or something like that.
Yes, or you know, I mean, it's a little more playful example, but you know, if you're ever in the park and somebody throws a frisbee and it accidentally comes your way, and you could catch it, you know, what kind of person goes, I better not? Not my frisbee, you know, or I might drop it. You go, oh, it's so cool if you can do it, you know. So there's some feeling like that, and I think that's a very, as an artist gets older, I think it's a little harder to get into that playful zone, because you do have the history of some production, you have your ego responding to the attention it's gotten, and so the force that would keep one in the rut is stronger. But that book is actually David Foster Wallace's favorite book on art, The Gift. It's a beautiful book.
So then you mentioned that it was a pietà you glimpsed immediately in this. The plaque, which maybe you saw and maybe you didn't, at the crypt, describes Lincoln not wanting to leave his son alone and cold in this place. And if you see the place, it's out on a ridge over what's now the Rock Creek Parkway. And the weather was bad, as your novel is historically accurate. It must have been really cold, and to think of leaving your son's body on the first night of his afterlife, or just afterlife, in that place, it's a horrible thought. But you as an artist had in mind, I guess from the Catholic tradition, this preformed image of a pietà. Can you speak about where that came from, or how that was such an immediate response for you?
It was literally that first day. It just popped in my head, the idea of Lincoln with his son across the lap. And the way my artistic mind works is that when an image like that comes in my mind, my impulse is to go research it. And my experience tells me don't do that. Just, that came to you, just let it sit there. The part I'm responding to is there's a little sort of internal like this that happens, like, ooh. That feeling I know to trust. And what I've learned the hard way is if you get that feeling like, ooh, which is also accompanied by a sense of verbal fullness, like, ooh, there's a lot to say about that. Or sometimes it's just, you stumble on a certain voice and there's a lot to say in that voice. Then what I've learned is stop. Go do something else. Think about something else. That's almost, that feeling will continue to grow if you just leave it alone. If, on the other hand, I turn to it with my little mid-level intellect and go, what's the metaphor? The thing is like a little forest animal and it runs back in the woods, like, no way, you know. So the thing that I've learned is to it's got hoofs to it, you know. But to sort of have that first feeling that, ooh, this is exciting, and then have the self-discipline to just stop right there. And then as soon as possible go into the writing room, but not to necessarily follow. So I did have the image of the pietà, but of course also it was then transformed into, it was Lincoln with the child. Stop there, that's a beautiful image. And maybe it's this idea, the beautiful image contains multitudes of things if you don't disrupt it. So that's the hardest part, because in any artistic enterprise, the first impulse is insecurity. You know, I don't think I can do it. I'm sure I'll screw it up. And the antidote that we apply to uncertainty is over control. You know, any writer knows you have an idea for a story, and then the whole day you're going, how would I end it though? How would I end it though? What would it be about that would justify its existence? You think as soon as you nail those things down, you're good to go, but actually, in my experience, you've just killed it. You know, there's these three little mantras I always recite. One is Donald Barthelme said, the writer is that person who, embarking on her task, does not know what to do. That's a good one. The poet Gerald Stern, and I'll clean it up just because Catholicism is in the air, but he said, if you set out to write a poem about two dogs making love, and you write a poem about two dogs making love, then you wrote a poem about two dogs making love. Think about it. And then, but not too much. And then Einstein said, no worthy problem is ever solved in the plane of its original conception. So all of these things are saying, to the extent that you yield to the very understandable impulse to over-control your material, you're going to kill the very thing that can make it come alive. So that's the kind of the artistic conundrum. You have to allow yourself to not think in order to get your mind into this higher mode that I mentioned.
So then the $64,000 question is, how do you get from that beautifully described trust in your own intuition to a book which, comic as it is, vivid as it is also a deep philosophical plunge into this, what happens in the moment after death? You know, it's not all intuition. There's a lot of learning there. There's a lot of speculation. There's Buddhism and Catholicism and the kind of 19th century bread and butter Protestantism of the characters all converging there. I mean, how do you get from the intuition to a novel that's so spiritually and intellectually robust on so many levels?
Well, thank you. And also, you make a great point, which the shtick says don't think, but the actual practice says think a little. But when it starts getting your way, stop it. You know, it's much more gradation. For me, it's something like this. Again, in the spirit of self-gaming, every journey starts off with a single step. So you say, what voice should I use? And then actually, the supreme doctrine is don't suck. If you start with a certain voice and it seems to suck, and by which I mean it bores you, it would bore others, it's enacting a position of condescension, but then don't do it. So for this book, the first thought was maybe it's Gore Vidal's Lincoln, that voice, which is a beautiful voice, applied to these events. So you try that out. If you're me, you try it out mentally a little bit, like, and really it's just, you say, on a chill February night, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, already I don't want to read that book and I don't want to write it, So again, the trick is to say, I believe you, intuition, let's not do that book. And then a little voice says, but if you don't do that, how are you going to do it? And you say, well, I don't know, but what we're not going to do is start a book that we don't love. Okay. So then, then you start playing around with it a little bit until you find a form and a structure that gives you that feeling again. And meanwhile, you're researching. And with this book, that was a great pleasure to just read all over the place. And I always imagine there's kind of a big silo that you're putting all this information in. And if you do that, you become supercharged with ideas. But you're sort of keeping them up there until you need them. So the model is you have all these traditionally obtained ideas about religion and philosophy and the actual history. You're keeping them up here, and then as you're writing the book in those intuitive moments, that thing will discharge as needed. As opposed to the other way around, which is you have all this research that you're desperately trying to get into your book. So it's it's intuition with a lot of preparation. And then the other self-gaming is to say, I need some stupid structure in this thing. And then not to overinvest that moment with too much meaning. So I said, okay, my structure is Lincoln comes in, holds the body, leaves. Good enough. Willie is there, shouldn't be, and for a long time he either stays or goes. I didn't know. Those are the two, that's the simple structure. Then you kind of start to just populate the structure with substructures every day. So I guess my answer is I don't really know. So you kind of leap into it and every day submit to this intuition, and slowly the thing starts to take on a shape that I never could have imagined at the beginning. Partly because the story is an organic system and it responds to itself. If I say once upon a time there was a dog with two heads, and we let that idea sink in, that's the first line of the story. It's an organic system, and it's only going to be a good story if we take into account that fact for the rest of the story. It can only respond to itself. So that's how structure grows. You say, I say, Lincoln had complicated feelings about his son's death. And the gods of fiction say, how so? Well, they had this party. They had a party the day his son sickened. So then suddenly those are scenes. I don't know. It's hard to talk about, actually.
Let's say Father Mark and I have passed back and forth our really a reverence for Flannery O'Connor and her insights on fiction. And many of them took my head off when, having failed to get into the Syracuse writing program, I went to the Columbia program. And one was that she speaks of art arising out of the limitations of the writer. That there's only a certain kind of character she can make live. There's certain material that's alien to her, I'm alien to a great deal. And I hear, both in what you said earlier from the microphone and what you're saying now, you framing an approach out of certain limitations, that you can't do that Gore Vidal voice, you're not going to go in for the full dress costume historical fiction. So is that how you get to the kind of theater of voices approach of this book?
Right. That's exactly right. I think the quote that she said, a writer can choose what he writes, but he can't choose what he makes live. And that, Syracuse, I see my students coming up to that point where you say, but I love Faulkner. And the world says, you can't do it. Or, you know, you think you're a musician who's going to write these great Shostakovichian string quartets, and whenever you do that, everybody falls asleep. But when you pick up the accordion, people dance. That's a big artistic moment, you know. I want people to dance. So I think exactly, to say to yourself, I am this collection of limitations. Then the weird thing is, if you don't despair at that point and you embrace the limitations, they actually convert to strength in some strange way. I don't know why that happens, but submitting to your weaknesses is another way of what you actually say is, I'm not going to do that which I can't nail. You know, if I can't do it well, I'm just going to not do it. Which actually is another way of saying structure. You know, if I like Manuel Puig in Kiss of the Spider Woman, I think he just realized he's incredibly great at dialogue. So he broke all the rules and wrote a book entirely in dialogue, and every page sings. You know, so I think that with my students, I try to tell them it's often the things that we're most embarrassed about. For me, again, it was my working class roots, the limitations of my reading life, my dark imagination, my staccato mind. All my early work was trying to eradicate that stuff. And even in person, I would sometimes attempt to speak more slowly in order to get dates. You know, it never worked. So it is, you know, but to submit to your weaknesses is actually a way of finding what your strengths are, I guess.
And in any way, is that bound up with this applied spirituality of writing that you set out? It certainly was for O'Connor, and then that's what I, as a Catholic, took away partly, that the sense of all of us as limited creatures. I was, you know, an ambitious person who wanted to read everything and do everything kind of the way you're describing, and then realizing, no, I have to be a certain, work within my limitations and the person that I am and the writer that I am, and then, so it's not just technical or what I can do as a writer, but it has to do with character also.
Yes, and I think too, you know, what I noticed is when I was younger, writing was really the only power play I had. I loved it, but I also really thought of it as a way to get over, you know, to make a life for myself, to I always had a feeling of really loving the world, finding the world remarkably beautiful, and myself inadequate to be in it, you know. And even as a really young kid, I thought, if I just achieve enough, I'll be worthy of the world, which is, you know, psychologically not that great, but I was smart enough to recognize it myself early and go, well, okay, that's how it is, so I better work, you know. But so early on, it's a way of having power over the world, and as I said, having power over your reader. And then the beautiful thing that happens, and I think it happens no matter what we lose ourselves in, is you see that that's not a very powerful position in terms of ultimate power. To be trying to, you know, win over the world, exert control, it's a very, it's a dead end. And as you lose yourself in craft, you start to see what a beautiful thing a short story form is. And then you submit yourself to it. You say, please let me do one good example of you in my life. And the story form says, well, we'll see, you know. But you're going to have to lose yourself a little bit. You're going to have to submit to the requirements of the form. So, and I think much as in any spiritual tradition, you start off with the power of ego, and ego is good. And then you see that it's limited. And when the ego recedes and something else comes in, I would say God, Buddha nature, or sometimes a sense of community, then that's when the real power starts to happen. So it's maybe art, I think, for me, has been a way of speeding up the process of life, meaning, as we used to say, we must diminish and Christ increase. You know, that the temporary George guy is a collection of habits and obstructions, which is very fond of itself. But the deep lesson is that thing can, like an eggshell, it can fall away, and there's something inside there that's eternal and luminous, that's not you, but it comes through you. Art, I think, speeds that process up, because if you cling to yourself and your wit and your power and your cleverness, your books won't do what you want them to do. You have to literally get out of your own way. And craft, for me, has been a mechanical way of inducing that, I guess I would say.
Father Mark made reference to the sorrow in the novel, and as a father, I had to turn away from the book because the sense of the loss of Willie and the sorrow that Lincoln felt were just too powerful. I have 3 sons. It was so powerful. I had to kind of stand off for a bit. But then, alongside that, the other characters what they're feeling is more like regret and a grasp of the wonder of life now that they're cut off from it. It reminded me of the line from the Mass, for what we have done and what we have failed to do, which is that it's fair to say about the characters who surround Lincoln and Willie? They're swelling with regret and missed opportunities.
I had forgotten that beautiful line, for what we have done.
Well, you probably knew it in Latin, right?
Yeah, I forgot that too, so I can do it in Pig Latin.
I'm a little later than you, I just knew it straight 70s English.
That was, there's a thing in the Buddhist text, and originally I had read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I thought this would be great. The novel will comply with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's too hard. I don't understand it. It's really deep. Also, you realize that a novel doesn't want to comply with any except dramatic urgency. So I put that idea aside. But the one idea that stayed with me was in the Tibetan tradition, they say that the state we're in right now, with our powerful, neurotic, desirous minds, they're so powerful, but they're also dampened by our bodies. So we're very lucky because while we're here on earth, we can work, we can do spiritual work because the mind is quieted down a little bit. But they say, it's like your mind is a wild horse tied with a rope to a post, and that's the body. Well, the texts say that when you die, that rope gets cut, and the wild horse that is your mind is expanded 1,000,000 times. So if you're a jealous person, somebody cuts you off in traffic, multiply it by 1,000,000. If you're neurotically self-shaming, times 1,000,000. That part of it was when I went to create the ghost. That was on my mind. Was that whatever they did in life, even if it was small, if they had a feeling of denial toward it, then they brought that with them and it got supersized, and then they had to somehow work through it. But in the process, you develop so much sympathy for them, so much love for them, and every so often I'd have this feeling of going, "Oh, you poor dumb dead people, ha ha ha! I'll never be like." And then you think, well, what am I doing that it would be supersized times 1,000,000? But yeah, I think they had for whatever reason, each of them was stuck there. So I imagine that there'd be a small percentage of the actual dead at Oak Hill. Most of the people at Oak Hill, like all of us, just happily go on to heaven and it's no problem. But that handful of miscreants, or people who had a little too much unrequited love or a little too much clinging or attachment, they stay there. And it is definitely what we have done. And then, you come out on the other side and you go, oh my God, I never told so-and-so what I felt. Or my worst nightmare is you look back at the collection of all the moments in your life and you go, I was 20% present for all that shit. That's my fear. And I know I'm doing it. I mean, I'm totally sure I'm doing it. But,
Because of the title, I guess I thought at first, and accept my superficiality, I'm looking at the book of the story before I'd even read about it. Now someone's making Lincoln into a Buddhist. He's already been the melancholic, he's been this, he's been that. But it seems to me that he stands powerfully outside of the Buddhist conception that all is suffering and that we just need to accept that he's got a classical humanist conception of my son is dead and I want him back, and this isn't my weakness or something I should grow out of. I have a pure sense of loss. I'm speaking as Lincoln. In other words, is it correct to say that his response to Willie is not Buddhist at all?
No, well, I'll tell you a story. There was a beautiful story about a Tibetan Lama, highly realized Lama, whose son died. And he just was crying all the time. And one of his disciples said, but Master, you're an enlightened being. And he says, yes, and my son died. So this idea of the relative and the absolute. I think for me, the Buddhist idea that I found coming alive in the book was this one. We suffer because we are really convinced from birth of our separateness from one another and the universe and our permanence. And we all have, I think it's Darwinian, we all are born thinking, wow, finally the world can start. I'm here. And I'll be here forever, so just come by any time. So this causes us to make big diluted mistakes about our position in the world. I think what happens to Lincoln, and it happens to all of us, many times when we lose somebody, the curtain drops and you go, oh, death does not make exceptions for me. And as he says in the book, what did you do wrong? He mistook this kid for a permanent entity. He says two clouds of smoke became fond of one another. We all rationally know that that's true. We know, if we think about it, that everything we care about will go away, but we don't really know it here. So that, to me, is real. When Buddhists say life is suffering, they're not saying life is miserable. They're saying we are all caught in this position of thinking that if we could just fix things and keep them permanently fixed, we'd be happy forever. When reality says nothing's getting fixed, ever. And everything is going away. And the only reason that makes you unhappy is because you're so convinced that you're permanent. So I think Lincoln gets a little left in that. I would say he's actually, in his conduct in the war, what you in Buddhism call a bodhisattva. And people describing him would say he'd go into a meeting and conduct himself so that the right end would result. In other words, he could totally submerge his ego. He could make fun of himself. He could make himself look ridiculous. He could make himself look powerful. He would do whatever the situation needed so that it would have an outcome that would be desirable. And I would go a step further and say an outcome that would minimize the sum total suffering. So in that sense, I think he was Buddhist.
Okay.
You'd probably argue with that, but
I want to open questions to the audience, but just, if only for my personal curiosity, just going back to the Pietà, what's beautiful about Christianity is that it totally honors the fact that the mother feels the total loss of her son. She doesn't say, well, he was, he's God, so what's my feeling compared to that? No, she's his mother, she's devastated. And the same was true, Bach raised kids in a time of great infant mortality, and all the scholars say, well, there was great infant mortality, he had 20 children, yes, of course he lost 7, but Bach didn't feel that way. He mourned each of them totally when they died after 6 days. And so, just to end this peroration, what's so powerful about the novel is that you do represent Lincoln as a sort of bodhisattva in public life, the person who has to reduce the level of overall suffering without depriving him of his wish to totally feel the loss of his son, man to boy, and nothing,
thank you.
and not abstracting out from that.
Thank you.
Is that
It's a beautiful, yeah, put that on the book jacket. And for me, one of the things that, I think fiction at its best, and Chekhov for me is sort of the king of this, it makes true ambiguity. It puts two viable contradictions there, and it lets them just sit there. I love that idea. So for this book, I thought, love is real. We all know it. I mean, we're out at a reading, but basically, we're always in connection with a handful of people that we love dearly. That's why we're living. No one would ever want to deny that. Put that up here. True. Absolutely. Then everything's going away. All of those things you just listed are going away. Ugh. Also true. So, can you, for a couple seconds, hold those two ideas in your mind at once? I can't do it for very long. I mean, the book, there's all kinds of tricks you use to make it look like you're thinking about that for 4 years, but I wasn't. It was just, even now it's an unthinkable contradiction. But I would say, to go back to my earlier theme, a spiritual life is one in which you let those contradictions sit up there for a couple seconds a day even, and go, yep, that's true. Then let that knowledge percolate into your body, and you go out and do your best.
And that's why the novel's so satisfying, is your better self, something you said, it's kind of your better self is the self in the novel.
Yes.
That has those contradictions and tension, and they're so beautifully contrapuntal or whatever, more than they would be in everyday life.
I hope. And I think, too, as a writer, you get into your very best self, and then the reader is her very best self, and you're like two fish. You just kiss. I don't know if the fish actually do that. But I mean, that idea that, you're not reading with your usual mind. Your mind is getting rarefied and coming out, and my mind is getting, and even across years and distance, we can make that connection. Yeah.
Wow. Questions from the audience? Thank you. In the back.
Just a couple of comments. Thank you for thank you for writing.
Thank you. I
And
can't
you
help
referred to the mask as hiding insecurity. It seems to me, in your case, the humor mask hides the incredibly deep intellect and thinking that you exhibit here this evening. I'm curious as to what you found in Buddhism that was lacking in Catholicism.
Thank you for that. Actually, at the time, it was very temporal. Here's how I felt, and I'm not saying this is what Catholicism actually says, but the conditions at the time let me think. The Christian traditions had done a good job of making me feel that I was lacking. I could see where I was flawed. What I wasn't getting too much of was how do I fix it? Now I know that such things exist, but I didn't find them at that moment. The Buddhist thing seemed to say, we're not even a religion. I've heard that before. We're just going to give you some techniques. Do these things and your mind state will actually change. And as I said, it happened instantly. So I think it was mostly that there was less, in my experience of it, less theory at that point and a lot more practice. And the practices were pretty simple and they yielded results immediately. So that was really the only difference at that time. Now, had I read differently, had I gone deeper into Merton, I think I would have found practices, but at that point, the Buddhist practices came first.
As an author, what do you think about reading your book versus listening to your book?
Oh, the question was about reading the books versus listening. My theory is you should do both and pay full price. No, that audiobook was a real adventure. 166 readers on it, and I listened to it for the first time. I drove from New York to California in 3 days, listened to it, and it was different. It was very different. It felt slower to me than I'm a pretty fast reader, and when I wrote the book, I think I assumed there'd be some scanning. So, for example, of the attributions at the bottom of each speech, when I read the book, I don't really even read them. I skim them a little bit. And in the audiobook, you hear them read out. I noticed certain passages hit me harder because of that delay, I think. But with this book, I was so grateful to have gotten to it. And I'm just happy for anybody to experience it in any way that they do. There was a really beautiful little virtual reality film made. Has anyone seen that? We went on tour, you could actually go, they'd give you the goggles, and you're standing there and Willie's up on the crypt, and then suddenly you hear footsteps and you turn and Lincoln walks by you. And it's kind of, beautiful.
Right here in the 10th row, I guess. Thank you.
Do you have any advice for college students?
Yes. Not surprisingly. Yeah. Well, I guess it would depend which college student. Well, you seem pretty smart, so here's what I teach this here. Are you a writer? Is that the idea? No. All right. Probably you know better than I do at this point. But the one thing I say to my students is, it's a time in our country's history when I think the role of the young intellectual is to go into the world and have his or her projections broken up. In other words, we live in a time when the division we all know about, the division also seems to be, generally speaking, such that writers and people in the academy tend to be on the left, like me. I'm a little left of Gandhi. But then the part of the country that we don't understand, if I could say we for a second, that is, historically, writers have gone over there and figured it out. Tried to divest themselves of their projections and their political feelings and maybe even their resistance or revulsion and get over there and look into it. So that's something I'm telling my students is we all huddle around the campfire of our existing beliefs. The thrill of the intellectual life is to be able to force yourself to go over there and see for yourself. In the 30s, guys like Dos Passos and Steinbeck, and they were going into the middle of the country to just have a firsthand experience of what it is. And I think this division, which is being reinforced by social media and old-fashioned media, I really believe art is the only way to break it down. Because as we've been saying, art is about specificity and complexity and individuation as opposed to projection. And I think, I actually think a wave of novels could actually get us back on track. I might be naive about that because people have to read the books, but so I guess we get out, go out and live. And for my students, I teach in an MFA program, and the idea, craft is what we talk about all the time, as if by just perfecting craft you could become a great novelist. I think that's kind of true, but there's another part that we don't talk about, which is that if you meet Zadie Smith or you meet David Foster Wallace, you are meeting rare, incredible individuals. People who are just fascinating to listen to. They speak in a distinctive voice. They have an incredible relation to truth. So one of the things I tell my students is, do that. Be amazing. But one of the ways you can do that is by going into the world. Going into the world and taking your beliefs as beautiful as they are and just scuffing them up a bit with the actual, and you'll see that they're in better shape after you're done, if that makes sense. Also, buy a stock that's low and later will come up.
George, do you think, so you're from Illinois, Lincoln's a great man of Illinois. Lincoln is more than probably anybody in the history of this country the figure who belongs to us all. On some level, was that an instinct of yours to make sure you weren't treating a marginal figure, but a character that people from different parts of the country could come toward?
Well, actually, it was that when I was done. But when I started, I thought, oh God, Lincoln. Lincoln's in car commercials. He's on Parks and Rec. So the fear was to come back to this overly familiar guy and have him be just that guy. But again, as we said earlier, when you have, if you have a work of art that doesn't have a potential problem, you're in big trouble. Because you'll just phone it in and everybody will go, oh yes, interesting. So when I got onto Lincoln, I thought, oh, that is a real iceberg in your ocean. And so then you have a way to proceed, which is, there's a Hollywood producer one time, and he asked me to write this scene in a kitchen between a husband and a wife. I'm like, I don't know if I can do that, and I did it, and it was so pedestrian. And I said to him, if we film this the wrong way, it could really stink. And he goes, how about we don't film it the wrong way? So when you think Lincoln, you say, how about, you list the things that are catastrophic about Lincoln. List them. Don't do that. And suddenly then it becomes kind of it's like these artists who talk about putting obstructions in their way. Lincoln became an obstruction. So then you think, oh, well, how do I do it? Well, one thing is, if I was going to try to do a Lincoln impersonation right now, my best Lincoln impersonation, first thing I do is lower the lights way down. Then I would go stand behind that curtain, and I would stick my head out for just a second and pull it back in. And what I wouldn't say is 407 years ago. So what I try to do is not let Lincoln stay on the stage too long. Don't look at him directly ever. And when he says something, always try to go to the second order thing he might say while still keeping in character. And then it's just it's a magic show. You don't. It's like when I said, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. It's not Lincoln, but it's supposed to look like him, something like that.
Way in the back, towards the food.
My family lovingly refers to your work, and especially this book, as empathy fan fiction. And so
I never liked your family.
yeah, come over anytime. So I'm wondering, in relation to your answer to the previous question, if you feel that when you write, sort of especially how you embody different characters with various different quirks, if there's a political impulse there, or whether it purely stems from a sort of, I guess from your conversation about limitations and attempting to find answers for yourself, or whether there is some impulse that you want to actually show a various array of peoples.
There is a political impulse, which I try to resist, because political impulse for me turns into lecturing people about that which I already know, which nobody wants that. For me, I guess the thing is, empathy is one of those words that kind of has a bit of a bad rap now. Empathy means, you just drove a spike through my head. Thank you so much for the coat rack. That kind of progressive, weak. But for me, in fiction, you do the exercise, empathy. Okay, let's hit that with a hammer and see what it breaks down into. Well, empathy, I think, breaks down to attention and accuracy. So if I'm imagining a character, the first impulse is going to be to project something onto that person because I need him to do a certain thing. Let's say I have a story about a barber who's kind of a misogynist, and I knew a guy like that, and I decided to crucify him in a story, wrote this barber. Okay, so I knew he was the misogynist barber. Fun. The story form doesn't like that kind of position. So I wrote some pages of this misogynist barber, had a lot of fun at his expense. He was a real jerk, and we were all laughing at him together. And then the story locked up and said, how long are you going to do this? Because it's kind of cruel. You made him, and now you're mocking him. That's not a fair thing. And the story locked up for almost 2 years while I tried to figure out how to like the guy. And I didn't like him by changing him into a better person. Because I'm not Mr. Subtlety, I just said that he had no toes on one foot. That was my great stroke of genius. But as soon as I said that, I did kind of like, oh, yeah, he's hateful to women, but oh gosh, he feels so unlovable, So is that empathy? Kind of. I mean, empathy is cutting off the toes on one of his feet. But it's attention. It's attention. So suddenly now, he went from being a stock character to being real. And because he was real again, I had to really start paying attention to what he would think and say. So I think the portrait comes out is of empathy. But sometimes it's just saying a real snotty thing about somebody and then qualifying it. The reason it feels like empathy is because the reader has followed you and said, oh yeah, that stupid barber, I hate that kind of person. And then you go, however, he doesn't have any toes on one foot. You go, oh. And you feel implicated in your earlier hatred, and that's empathy. Suddenly, you're corrected, So I think that, for me, it's attention. And as I said earlier, the attention, even that's abstract, it's language, If a joke doesn't work, there's something morally wrong with it. If a line is causing boredom, there's something autopilotish about it. So that to me is a great practice. I like the idea of being an empathy person or a kindness person. I'm not really in life so much, but in work, there's a practical way. The story will sit there and wait for you to become a little more attentive, and then it'll let you go. So tell your family I said hi.
Fifth row near the aisle.
Hi. I'm just curious what role songwriting plays in your life and how it might compare to, say, short story writing. And also, I have a pumpkin pancake if you would like it.
How long has it been in that thing?
A very good question. It looks worse than the actual.
It looks worse than it is. Now, you put that on the label. It looks worse than it is. I will accept that. Songwriting for me is just a perpetual frustration. I've been writing songs for 20 years, never one that I would stand behind. So at this point, it's just a fun hobby. It also helps my teaching a little bit because, it's easy to get glib about process. I like to get glib about process. But for the student who hasn't yet come through that gate, that kind of talk isn't helpful. So when I try to write a song and fail, it reminds me of how difficult it is to be on the other side of the gate. It's not, so it's just a ritual humiliation, actually. Are you a songwriter yourself?
A bit of the same, yeah.
Yeah. It's hard. It's much harder. I mean, I think that my sense is, and I know some really good songwriters, and they have they take this intuition to a level that I can't. Jeff Tweedy is a friend of mine from Wilco, and he says he writes songs he records all the music, and then he sits there with a microphone and he just makes sounds that he likes. And then he does it over and over until words certain sounds seem to want to be a word, then that's the word, and he just has the patience of doing it over and over again, and at some point the lyrics are there, and he says what fascinates him about it is that it's not random. It's not just gobbledygook. There's actually some really profound meaning that's relevant to him that came out in this way. So that relates to this intuition idea. But there's a technical term, I'm too much of a tight ass to actually get into that place where I'm free associating. I can't do it. It's too risky.
David Byrne says a similar thing to Jeff Tweedy. I'm also from Syracuse, so if you ever want to play an open mic at Funkin' Waffles, I'm down.
That, sir, will never happen. And if you heard me, you would rescind the invitation. But thank you.
They do have, well, the pancake still stands.
They're good, yeah.
One more question right here.
My question is about your novel is really experimental in a lot of ways, and my question is about some of the characters are so quirky, or there's something so different about them in the afterlife that I almost had to Google a few times, like, was Hans Bollman really having an eternal boner for a long time? But I'm just curious about how you would draw the boundary between what could be so out there and what could be still relatable to the reader to understand the novel.
That's a great question. And you know, the answer is, I mean, it's kind of like in this intuitive way of writing. I read the book just about every day that I worked on it from the beginning. I sit down and read it from the beginning and watch that needle. And if you do something that's too much, which in a world of ghosts, I mean, anything can happen in a world of ghosts. So often there would be things that were just like, oh, you know, you turn into a rhinoceros, great. The needle goes down. It goes down at the moment when the reader feels you're taking advantage of the situation. You know, so really the answer is you just read it every time and you see statistically, would a reader accept the eternal boner? There's a line for you. Would the reader accept the eternal boner? But you know, but really, and you feel it in your gut as a reader, as the first-time reader. If the answer is no, you're gone too far, then you have to rein it back in. And the second idea is that you have to rein back in the eternal boner. The second notion is that I think you should never. Basically, my mantra was no experiment for experimentation's sake. Don't do it because it's wacky. Don't do it because it's crazy. Only do what's in service to the emotional life of the book. So that's a kind of a self-discipline that says just because you can, doesn't mean you should. Then you always sort of knew when you were going too far. You know, I had Tobias Wolff. One of my student stories had a bunch of dream sequences in it, and he said in his very sweet way, he said, you know, in a writer's career, you're allowed 3 dream sequences. So don't use them all up in one story. So this idea that you're already asking for a lot of indulgence from a reader. Enter my imaginary universe. If you say, and then it was all a dream, the reader goes, oh, come on. I knew it was all a dream. A story is a dream. So it's always a matter of self-correcting. And again, for me, to go back to this idea of intimacy, you know how when someone tells you their actual dream, you can take a little bit of it, and then you switch off. You switch off because it's random. Storytelling can't be random. So I think you just have to sort of say, when would the person switch off? Then forgive them for switching off and pull them back on track.
George Saunders, thank you so much. Thank you to Father Mark.